So picture this. The Berlin Wall comes down, the Cold War is over, and suddenly the old map of world politics, capitalism versus communism, is totally useless. It's like someone threw all the puzzle pieces up in the air. How on earth were we supposed to make sense of this new world? Well, political scientist Samuel Huntington came along with an answer. A really powerful, and let's be honest, deeply controversial new map. He called it the Clash of Civilizations, and it completely changed the way a lot of people thought about global politics. So let's unfold his map and see what it's all about.
All right, so here's our game plan for breaking this all down. First, we're going to look at why we even needed a new map for politics. Then, we'll get into the main players, this whole idea of a civilizational divide. After that, we'll dig into the evidence he presented for a clash, then explore the really explosive part, the West versus the rest. And finally, we'll see what kind of rules he suggested to, keep the peace in this new world.
Okay, let's start at the beginning. To really get Huntington's theory, you have to transport yourself back to that moment in time, a world where it felt like all the old rules of the game had just vanished. For almost 50 years, the world was, in a strange way, kind of simple, right? You had two teams, Team USA and Team USSR. It was capitalism versus communism. Nations picked a side. But then, after 1990, that clean division just evaporated. It left this huge question mark hanging over everything. What was going to draw the new lines on this totally scrambled map?
And this quote? This is Huntington's big answer. He basically said, forget politics, forget economics. The new conflicts, the real fault lines, were going to be about something way older, way deeper. Culture. Now, for a world that was so used to thinking in terms of political systems, this was a really radical idea, and for a lot of people, a pretty disturbing one, too.
So, if culture is the new dividing line, not ideology, then who are the new players on the world stage? This brings us right to the heart of his entire theory, the civilizational divide. The key word here is civilization, and what I think is so fascinating is how he defines it. A civilization is the biggest us you can possibly identify with. Think about it for a second. Someone from Paris is a Parisian, they're French, they're European, but at the absolute broadest level, they're part of Western civilization. It's the ultimate cultural team jersey. So, using that definition, Huntington basically redrew the world map. He wasn't seeing hundreds of individual countries anymore. Nope. He saw just 8 of these massive cultural blocks. And here's the kicker. He predicted that for the first time in history, global politics wouldn't be about conflicts inside the West, but about the clashes between all these different civilizations. So, what's the glue holding these massive groups together? For Huntington, the answer was overwhelmingly clear: religion. He was leaning on ideas from historians like Christopher Dawson, who said the great religions are the foundations on which the great civilizations rest. Christianity for the West, Islam for the Islamic world, Hinduism for the Hindu civilization. You get the picture. It's like the cultural DNA. Okay, so that's the theory. But is it just some idea cooked up in an ivory tower, or is there actual proof? Well, that brings us to our next section, where worlds collide. Let's look at the evidence Huntington pointed to argue that this clash wasn't just coming, it was already happening. He basically built his case on 2 huge observations. First, he pointed to conflicts that were flaring up right on the borders where these civilizations meet. He called them Faultline conflicts. And second, he saw this powerful revival of non-Western cultures all around the world. Cultures that were pushing back and asserting their own identities. I mean, just look at the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. For Huntington, this was the perfect, tragic example of a fault-line conflict. It wasn't just some local squabble. As you can see in the quote, you had Orthodox Russia siding with Orthodox Serbia, Catholic Germany supporting Catholic Croatia, and Muslim nations rallying behind Bosnia. It was like a civilizational war in miniature. Huntington also looked at demographics as a kind of hidden engine driving conflict. And this chart really shows what he was talking about. You can see this massive youth bulge in many Muslim countries. About 20% of the population was young. Compare that to the aging populations in the West and Russia. For Huntington, that gap wasn't just a number, it was political dynamite. And he connected that data directly to what was happening on the ground. I mean, historically, big youth populations are a recipe for upheaval and change. Just think about the Arab Spring. Huntington argued this demographic engine would power what he called the Islamic resurgence.
as a whole new generation looked to reshape their societies and their place in the world. So all of this evidence, all these trends, they build up to the theory's most controversial, most explosive claim. And that's our fourth section, the idea that the central conflict of our time would be the West versus the rest.
Okay, so the core of the issue is this fundamental disconnect in perspective. The West tends to see its values, things like democracy, human rights, free markets, as being universal, as good for everybody. But a lot of non-Western societies look at that and see a new kind of cultural imperialism. What one side calls democracy promotion, the other sees as straight-up foreign interference.
And Huntington argued that this claim to have all the universal answers puts the West in a really tricky spot. Because the moment you don't apply your own principles consistently, you open yourself up to these really powerful accusations of hypocrisy and double standards. And Huntington didn't just talk in theories, he pointed to specific examples that critics of the West bring up all the time. Things like pushing for nuclear non-proliferation for Iran, but not for Israel, or talking about human rights in China, but not so much in Saudi Arabia. He argued these weren't just small slip-ups, they were seen as huge double standards that fueled real resentment and made other civilizations even more determined to resist Western influence.
So, if this clash is as real and dangerous as Huntington suggests, are we all just doomed to this future of endless conflict? Well, not necessarily. In our final section, we're going to look at his proposed rules for a new world, which were basically his ideas for how to avoid a global catastrophe.
Now, Huntington always insisted he wasn't predicting an inevitable war. He was trying to sound an alarm bell and offer a solution. He laid out 3 basic rules for keeping the peace. First, the abstention rule. Basically, the major powers need to stop meddling in the internal conflicts of other civilizations. Second, the joint mediation rule. When those faultline wars do break out, the big players have to work together to put out the fire. And finally, and maybe this is the most important one, the commonalities rule. Everyone in every civilization should be actively trying to find and build on the values we all share.
Decades after he wrote it, Huntington's theory is just as provocative as it ever was. It really forces us to ask a huge question about the world we live in right now. Are we actually locked in some kind of unavoidable struggle between these huge cultural teams? Or can we look past our civilizational identities and build a future on the common ground we all stand on? That's really the question his map leaves us with.